ready to keep you company wherever you are. Carte Blanche, the podcast, brings you immersive, hard-hitting stories anytime, anywhere, every week.
Welcome to another hefty installment of the WholeWeek Wrap with Daily Maverick and Carte Blanche. Joining us this week is Daily Maverick Managing Editor Janet Hurd to help us reflect on 30 years of democracy and so much more. Here's what's coming your way. The NPA is tired of waiting and urges ministers, accused and others to get a move on. Then, carnage in the Cape as gangs take hold. Later, the forgotten war. We turn our focus to Sudan's worsening civil war.
I think there is just often a blind spot and very poor reporting on our own continent, which should be actually the primary focus of reporting.
And the Supreme Court of Appeal comes to rape victims' defense. But first, this past Sunday, Carte Blanche aired a special 90-minute documentary titled 30 Years of Democracy. With the elections only a month away, we look back at the difficult road traveled, the importance of hope, and the future of a nation on the cusp of change. Good morning, Janet, and welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Hi, good to be here, Lizanne. Hi.
So this past weekend, we commemorated Freedom Day, and Carte Blanche aired a special documentary titled 30 Years of Democracy, in which we asked South Africans, how do you feel about South Africa? So, Janet, I want to hear from you. How do you feel about South Africa?
Oh, it's like the million-dollar question, isn't it? I obviously feel a lot of anguish. I think the whole country does. But there's always these things that just give us hope. And I've just been reading people's experience of covering 30 years of democracy. And I realize again that there is so much positive still, despite all the potholes, the constant seemingly degeneration of our new democracy. There is still a lot of hope. And I think in terms of what Carte Blanche has done by going out and about and actually speaking to people on the ground, not the politicians, to try and actually get to talk to real people and actually find the real pulse of the nation, which is quite hard to do. And I think we do get a bit overwhelmed when we're covering things day to day. You can actually sort of become a bit of a stuck record. So I think the irony is that this opportunity to look back and see how far we've come has actually given the public an opportunity to look back and actually say, yes, there's a lot wrong, but it's not despair. You know, I spent 94 in a beat-up combi as a very young freelance reporter and covering the country in the build-up to the elections. And it left an indelible mark on me to see real people, real experiences around the country in small, far-flung towns. And I did see that miracle of hope. And it was a kind of a miracle, 94. And I think Paul Weinberg has done some amazing photos in Daily Maverick on a reflection of 30 years, where he was the IEC official photographer and he got a real inside window of the build-up to the elections. And that's the feeling of that miracle, that there was this incredible sense of hope and dreaming, and that the dream is not dead in the water. There is still hope. And I think overall there's still a lot of good institutions in this country and good people, that anything can still happen. It must also be tricky for the youth who have no experience of the miracle of 94 and actually have no reason, why should they? They don't have that feeling of where it was just such an incredible moment of optimism.
Just speaking from our experience working on the documentary, 30 Years of Democracy, a lot of the youth also said something similar to what you just said, that even though there is this anguish, there's a lot riding on the outcome of the upcoming elections, that they have this hope and there's almost a bit of an excitement around it, that there's inevitable change on the horizon. They're not entirely sure what change and which way it's going to go, but they definitely feel optimistic about the future. And I think that is something we should all take from these interactions that we have and the stories that are being told.
Yeah, me too. And I think the youth are very relevant here, because there is a level of tiredness and fatigue. And that's why it's so lovely to see the rise of the voice of the youth, because they are the future leaders.
From Jacob Zuma to the Guptas to former Judge John Tlhophe, The National Prosecuting Authority says delaying tactics have become the biggest threat to the justice system. What does this say about our judicial system? And is speeding up judicial processes really the most obvious answer? Now, keeping to important political matters, there's a worrying trend that's been unfolding in recent years within our justice system in the form of Stalingrad tactics. Essentially, it's a tactic used by the accused to really wear down the state and other parties by appealing every decision made, dragging out court proceedings, and really using whatever means they have to delay matters. We've seen this play out with the case against former President Jacob Zuma, as well as the extradition with the Guptas. But we've also seen the case against former Judge President John Carte, which unbelievably, when I read a Daily Maverick article, I was reminded that this has been dragging on for 16 years. I nearly fell on my back when I was reminded of that. Now, firstly, why is this such a concern for those within the judiciary?
I think the fact that the MPA are saying Stalingrad tactics are the biggest threat to our democracy is very telling. And it also reveals the frustration that the MPA is obviously having with its attempts to bring people to justice, where they're just caught up in litigation and process. And I was just thinking that the Zuma trial, which has been going on forever, and I was just thinking, how is that possible? That after all these years, we're still literally sitting in a pre-trial situation. Former President Zuma is now 82 years old. It is very clear what is going on. So I think it also shows the big divide in this country, where justice is very short and swift for some, and then incredibly lengthy for those who can manipulate and use the system. But I mean, having said that, I don't want to make light of the importance of proper process. And everyone has a right to challenge process and try and get the best justice that they deserve. But obviously it's very clear that this is an abuse of the court system with the Zuma case and with the Guptas. And I found it interesting now that Shamila Batoy has actually revealed that they've approached the presidency to try and get some action there, to try and get Paul Mashatile during his visit to the UAE to actually see how they can actually resolve the impasse. And with the Carte case, it's slightly different. It is a Stalingrad tactic in terms of things taking so long. And then finally Parliament, and they actually, in an unprecedented move, impeaches Justice Carte. But in the meantime, Carte has approached the Court that the entire proceedings of Parliament were unjust. So now it's sitting with the Court, and there's a whole complicated process there of whether the judges of the Court could be seen to be conflicted. So it's very clear from just looking at this that this is not going to be a quick resolution. And this is definitely Schlappe's last move. It's the last throw of his dice. But it seems that it's not going to be a quick thing. So one wonders how that's going to play out and how long it's going to be till we finally see the end of the Schlappe matter.
It's been another bloody week in the Western Cape, as the Cape Flats sees an average of 2 deaths linked to gun violence each day. The majority of those killed are bystanders. According to a 2022-2023 report, a total of 802 gang-related murders were reported countrywide. Of those, 675 were in the Western Cape. That's more than 80% of all cases. So, has this become a battle authorities simply cannot win? Let's turn our focus to the Western Cape and the truly horrific levels of violence that's unfolding in and around Cape Town. In Khayelitsha, I mean, there was the one morning where 8 people were killed in just a few hours. I remember I saw the tweet and someone said it's 8 a.m. and 8 people are already killed in the Western Cape. It's nightmarish. And we've also seen a number of police officers come under attack while trying to crack down on the worsening violence. I know we've talked about this and the gang violence escalating in this region on the WholeWeek Wrap before, but it just seems like it's getting so much worse.
It's interesting that the day of where those 8 people were killed, I think in 3 incidents in Khayelitsha just in one morning, I was actually on leave and I was driving via Baden-Powell, and it was a few hours later, it must have been about 10:30, 11, and I just suddenly saw, and I still don't know if it was connected, but I just saw the spiral of like smoke coming through and a lot of police vehicles. And then a few hours later, I switched on the radio and I heard that I'd literally driven on the outskirts as 8 people had been killed. And it's just devastating to sort of try and make sense of the level of violence that is all around us in the Western Cape. And the level of gunfire, there just seems to be guns, a proliferation. It seems that all the attempts to try and grapple with the violence, and a lot of it's to do with extortion and gangs, have come to very little. I mean, in fact, It just seems to get worse and worse every year. And a Daily Maverick reporter on this matter, Karen Dolly, she recently wrote, she tried to compare the figures, and where apparently Reuters reported in 2022 in Sweden that there'd been a record 60 people fatally shot in Sweden. And this is gang violence related, where they say gang violence has become a major problem. In Western Cape, a province within South Africa, recorded more murders every 3 days this year than the number of shooting killings in Sweden, a whole country experienced in 2022. And I think this is the thing, to try and measure the scale of how regular it is on a day-to-day basis. There are several fatal shootings every day in Cape Town.
And she recently reported that, now that you've mentioned the stats, I remember reading the article, her most recent one, where she said that 33 people were killed in just 24 hours. And I can imagine how easy it is for people to become desensitized to this, because if that becomes your norm, you kind of roll your eyes and you say, oh, another one. But I think we've reached a point now where clearly the standard response from authorities is simply not doing the trick. So my question is, what can possibly be done to address this all-out war in the Cape Flats? Because that's really what it is now. We are now in a war situation.
I mean, they're constantly saying that they've bolstered deployments, that identified hotspots. I mean, the same rhetoric, but actually nothing changes. Obviously, there's societal issues that need to be addressed in the longer term, but in the shorter term, it is a crisis. Kids get caught in the crossfire and get killed in gang violence just so regularly. Sometimes these stories barely make the news because of this fatigue factor that you're referring to. And it cannot be solved overnight. But definitely what is clear to me is the lack of leadership in communities, or the breakdown of leadership in communities, and also the police. There's also a lot of corruption within the police force. And there is the class action by Gun Free South Africa currently playing out, where there were 2,000 firearms that went from the SAP to gangsters and were used in shootings. These are the issues that are leading to this proliferation of firearms, lack of, if you go and report it, what happens when someone is killed. There were 8 people killed in Khayelitsha last week. As far as I'm aware, there haven't been any arrests. And this is all too often the pattern, where there isn't accountability, nothing really happens, we don't see justice getting done, and then it just spirals.
In 2003, the Darfur War in Sudan began. The spark, a violent military coup driven by rebels calling themselves the Sudan Liberation Army. Since then, the civil war has been gradually heating up, and now, 20 years later, the conflict has taken on a new, more devastating form, as 2 military groups are vying for ultimate power. It's a war that very few are talking about, but it's time for Africa to pay attention. Now, speaking of wars, there's been a lot of focus on Ukraine and Gaza, but there's also been another war that's been unfolding, and that's, of course, in Sudan. And it's a conflict I think not many people are talking about. And that made me kind of wonder, why do you think that is?
Yes, Lizanne, I had the same thought. And I think there is just often a blind spot and very poor reporting on our own continent, which should be actually the primary focus of reporting, because it's our continent. That's what's happening on our doorstep. So Sudan, the capital, is under siege. I mean, imagine if Pretoria was literally under siege. Yeah. And it's been in the space of a year, marking a year on April 15. But they're saying it's the world's most complex and cruel crisis. That's how it's being described. And yet we don't really know a lot about it. And it is seen as the forgotten war. And they're saying that 16,000 people have been killed in a year and displaced millions of people. And one of the biggest problems is the hunger. And literally, where we've had reports now recently of where food production has been devastated. And basically, key staples such as sorghum and millet have dropped by up to 50% from the previous year. And in the markets of areas, the price of wheat is up 118%. So if we start looking at the impact of that war not just in terms only of numbers of people killed, but it's the impact of displacement and famine. That is a real human crisis. And I don't think the African Union is doing enough. I think South Africa is not doing enough. I think Cyril Ramaphosa is not doing enough. I think there was a lot of comment about the visit by one of the military leaders in the conflict coming to visit South Africa and being entertained by Cyril Ramaphosa. What came of that engagement? Why is there no real sort of call to action around this disaster, which is on our continent? And I think that we've got a lot to answer for here in terms of accountability again, where we just in the way that we have been justifiably outspoken against the violence playing out in Gaza, we should actually pay attention to what is happening in Sudan and rolling up our sleeves and trying to actually get peace there.
Note that the following discussion contains adult topics and is not suitable for younger listeners. The way in which the legal system treats rape and other sexual offences has always been a matter of debate. There's the concept of re-traumatizing the victim through rigorous medical exams, unflinching cross-examination, and having to relive their trauma many times over in the quest for justice. It's therefore crucial that presiding judges get it right when handing down and reviewing judgments. In October 2021, the Eastern Cape High Court handed down a shocking judgment in an appeal by Loyiso Koko. Koko, accused of rape in 2018, was found guilty in 2020, but in a subsequent appeal was made a free man. The reason the guilty verdict was overturned? That even though the victim explicitly said no to having sex, he mistakenly believed she had consented. That her willingness to kiss him and partake in oral sex amounted to tacit or implied consent. But the Supreme Court of Appeal disagrees and paved the way for rape victims to get the justice they deserve.
I want us to go back to the courts and specifically the Supreme Court of Appeal as we wrap up our show. A hugely important judgment was just delivered. It's a matter of, quote, tacit consent, and the case involved a 2021 High Court ruling in which 2 judges overturned a rape conviction. Now, in short, they found that the rape victim gave tacit consent when she agreed to foreplay and oral sex, and this was a very concerning ruling at the time. There was a lot of anger around this ruling from several organizations, activists, and so forth. Now, thankfully, through the SCA, sanity has prevailed, and I think this is a huge win in the ongoing fight against gender-based violence.
Absolutely, Lizanne. I think that was a very welcome ruling. It's been hailed by the groups that obviously were astonished when the original ruling was overturned, where it was said that it didn't constitute rape. You'd think we'd emerged as a global thinking that it doesn't matter what happens in any build-up to a situation, it doesn't mean you can be raped. And it's such a basic thing for me. It's so hard for me to fathom that a ruling could even have come that the foreplay meant that, okay, well, that's okay, then she can be raped. That is what that ruling amounted to, really. And it also took me back to thinking of that, for me, that really iconic film, The Accused, by Jodie Foster, which is from late 80s. But really, I actually looked at a clip again of that film in preparing for the show because that was such a iconic film about, it doesn't matter that Jodie, who played the character, had been having fun and was provocatively dressed how she wanted to dress. Whatever happens before, she ended up getting gang raped. And there was this kind of an attempt to mock her and laugh her off, and she had to fight. And this is a film, but it really did make an impression at the time because it did help to shift the attitudes that actually, at last, women were being seen, no means no. For me, it's as simple as that. So this was a very important ruling, and it just affirmed what I actually should be common sense, really.
Yes,
that,
absolutely.
of course, no means no, and don't invade anybody's body.
Yes. So I just want to read a section to our listeners of the judgment that really I feel underlines why this ruling is so vitally important, because really I can't put it any better than what the court stated in its ruling is, were the conclusion reached by the High Court to prevail, this would not only be a perverse incentive to unscrupulous persons taking advantage of their victims, but also have the effect of frustrating the speedy realization of the constitutional objective of gender equality, which is one of the foundational values of our constitutional order. And I feel that really just sums it up so strongly. It's such a powerful statement. But before we wrap up today's show, I understand you're jetting off to Chile this week for a World Press Freedom Day conference hosted by the UN. Now, following on from our discussion last week on the DM shutdown and the importance of independent media, I want you to quickly tell us a bit more about this before we set you off to the great Americas.
Yes, I'm very excited. It's a fantastic opportunity to be on a panel there about disinformation with the elections. I do think it puts the spotlight on what is such an important issue, and I think the Daily Maverick did provoke a lot of discussion after its shutdown, and I think it has shifted the dial a little bit in terms of putting it on the agenda, and it is a global issue. I think that's the important thing. The crisis of media in the globe is center stage, obviously, if you're a journalist, but it's also important as a public interest issue. So yes, I'm off to the UNESCO's hosting the 31st World Press Freedom Day in Santiago, and it's this year the focus is on the importance of journalism and freedom of expression in the context of the current global environmental crisis. So that should be a very interesting discussion, and I'm really looking forward to actually going there and just getting some idea. It's always good it's like traveling in your own country. It's good to get on the road and find out about how people are exploring 30 years of freedom, and sometimes celebrate some of the freedom of expression victories over the years, but also to look at the dangers, especially I think the big issue around disinformation is the real issue now globally. And so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to engaging and coming back to South Africa with some new ideas and to feedback into media in South Africa.
Well, I wish you all the best. But yeah, that's it for our show. This has been a very interesting chat. It's been a difficult one with lots of weighty topics. I think not really a green shoot today, but it's been an insightful and eye-opening one as always. Janet, thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you a wonderful week and safe travels.
Thank you very much, Lizanne. Bye.
And that's a wrap. Join us again next week as we unpack more local and international headlines. Until then, give Carte Blanche and Daily Maverick a like and follow on socials.